Australian Indigenous people have a long and complex history with nicotine, the drug most commonly associated with smoking tobacco. Several native Australian plants contain nicotine, some of which have traditionally been harvested, prepared, traded and chewed by Indigenous peoples across much of Australia. The most potent of these is patchouli, made from the leaves of the shrub Duboisia hopwoodii. Although Duboisia hopwoodii naturally occurs over much of southern and western Australia, most patchouli was prepared in southwestern Queensland, and from there distributed almost as far north as the Gulf of Carpentaria, south to Lake Eyre in South Australia, east to the mid-region of Queensland, and west to the area where Alice Springs is now located. Tobacco and the practice of smoking first reached the shores of northern Australia at the beginning of the 18th century, when the Mckesson fishermen sailed from Indonesia in search of food and pearls. The Mckessons acknowledged Indigenous ownership of the land and offered pipes, tobacco and other valued goods as tribute to local populations and in return for access to coastal waters and camping places between the Kimberley and the Gulf of Carpentaria. The Mckesson method of smoking, with the characteristic long-stemmed pipe formed from a crab claw, a hollow root or a reed, became part of Indigenous social and ceremonial life in these areas and is still in use in the East Arnhem region. Mckesson goods, including tobacco and pipes, were prized as trade items by the local population and were carried far inland. However, given the random nature of the supply from the Mckesson fishermen, it's unlikely that this exposure to the new tobacco resulted in ongoing addiction. With the arrival of the first fleet in 1788, British patterns of tobacco usage were introduced to Indigenous Australia. Tobacco was often presented in early encounters between the Europeans and Indigenous people as a token of goodwill. The introduced tobaccos and pipes soon became popular and widely sought after by Indigenous communities, whether or not they had been users of bush tobaccos or patchouli, and were highly valued along with other introduced commodities such as blankets, flour and sugar. The Indigenous people's desire for tobacco and other wares was quickly recognised by the European settlers, who offered them in exchange for labour, goods and services, and hoped that such bribes would lead the local people to forget their traditional lifestyle and become compliant participants in the settlers' activities. Indigenous people actively set about obtaining tobacco and other prized goods from their new sources. Communities negotiated and bargained to receive tobacco and supplies as compensation for use of the land and resources, in accordance with Indigenous tradition. However, the colonial intention to instill a Western work ethic with its foundations of regular habits, subordination of servant to master, economic incentives, and accumulation of wealth and goods remained opposed to the Indigenous way of life. Tobacco trade in the early days of colonisation has been seen as a process of mutual exploitation, both parties mostly satisfied from their side of the transaction. If the new settlers had the advantage of controlling tobacco supplies, the local inhabitants equally had the option of providing or withholding information, labour, and other assistance vital to the Europeans. Over time, however, this balance firmly favoured the new settlers. In the following years, tobacco usage and therefore addiction to nicotine spread across the continent with the expansion of European outposts through explorers, missionaries, pastoralists, cattle farmers, miners, fishermen, and others. In contrast to the European population, tobacco was used by Indigenous men, women, and children. Tobacco was also a trade item for some Indigenous groups, allowing the product to penetrate distant regions of Australia long before direct white contact was made. Tobacco dependency among Indigenous people was seen by the colonists as a civilising or taming influence. Civilising because it could aid discussion and good relations, and taming because it had the capacity to produce a cheap labour force prepared to work in return for tobacco. Widespread nicotine addiction made the Indigenous populations vulnerable to manipulation by the settlers, who could make provision of tobacco dependent upon compliance. At least one Victorian squatter deliberately fostered tobacco use among local Indigenous people, enabling him to secure their ongoing services in return for small amounts of tobacco. tobacco became standard payment. During the 1800s and the early decades of last century, Indigenous people worked in often brutal circumstances for the cattle and pastoral industries, on sugar plantations, in road and railroad gangs, and in the pearl shell and trepang trade, either being paid in full or in part with tobacco. Indigenous people were even involved in the very production of tobacco itself. Payment in rations and not in money meant that Indigenous people were not able to fully understand their worth as labourers and nation builders and the value of money. This kept Indigenous people working hard and working cheap. The level of desperation to satisfy nicotine addiction was so high that artefacts and ceremonial objects, language and local knowledge, oral history and cultural heritage were acquired by collectors, anthropologists and other researchers in return for tobacco. The decades following European colonisation saw gradual movement of communities of Indigenous people into white settlements in response to a range of influences, including government policies and other prevailing circumstances, and a desire for a range of provisions, including tobacco. The cost of this migration, along with the damage to individuals, families, communities and cultures, is still being felt today. There are many newspaper articles from the early 1900s outlining the use of tobacco rations, even special Christmas rations for the most needy. At the bottom of this article, it's quoted, "Old people were given a small stick of tobacco each Monday, which was smoked that same evening. They craved and begged for the rest of the week." This cartoon, titled "The Conversion of the Aborigines" from the fresco for the new Houses of Parliament, shows people drinking and fighting, with the man on the right smoking a pipe. The implied message is that for Indigenous people to be more like the colonials, they would have to have the same vices. While the supply of tobacco to our people has changed over the years, the impact remains the same. Many of our family and friends get very sick in their 30s and 40s from smoking, and some die soon after. Many of our family and friends spend a large chunk of their money buying cigarettes. Smoking 10 cigarettes every day for a year costs more than $2,000. If you smoke or know someone who smokes, please share the information that you've heard today.